Okay, we now know what we've got to build, so we can start to design it. That's quite different to actually knowing what you've got. We actually have to lay out, we have to structure so that we know what we're going to do when we do the application development process. So in this video, I'm going to cover items 8 through 12, and we'll talk through those as we get to them. Now, the sketching of designs of interfaces or forms or GUIs or whatever you choose to call them can be done in a couple of ways. In many cases, developers are a bit scared of their own handwriting and they don't think that it's going to be useful or even legible in some cases. And I think if this was a commercial project, that would be a really important point to make. And you should, where possible, make it as neat as you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we're going to do the sketches. I'm going to do it through software and through hand-drawn sketches. And each one, as I say, has their values. If it's by software, it's very neat, it's very tidy, and it can be presented to a client. But what also happens is that the process of drawing isn't the end of the story, be it through software or by hand. You've got to do what's called annotation. And annotation is crucial so that everybody understands what each element in the design sketch does and its purpose. So if we're talking about designing from software, ignore the handwriting from the minute. You're making this image using the software that will be used to develop the project so that the client has a clear understanding of what it will look like in terms of layout and what each control will look like on the form. Having established that, ignore the handwriting for a minute. I know it's hard, but what you would then do is, for the purposes of the team, not for the client, you'd add annotation. And I use color. I always do this when I'm developing an application, be it trivial or important or large or small. I try to get an idea of what I'm going to do and where I'm going to do it in the interfaces. So I add annotation. I use a lot of color, and it helps me to understand how the things are going to look and what they're for. Now, in this briefing, I'm briefing you for an assignment. If you have appropriate and effective annotation, it demonstrates your understanding and the attention to detail that you've put into the development process. It is going to earn you higher marks if you explain very clearly why you've made the choices you've made in the design process. So annotation is very powerful. So this is using software, and it avoids you having to do the messy stuff that is going to be presented for a client. But if it's for assessment or internal use, if it's just you doing it and you're never going to show it to anybody, then hand drawing says a lot. This is where I actually started before I drew the stuff in the software. I started by laying out the controls in a bit of squared paper, sketching with my awful handwriting. I've laid out the form before I designed it in software. When you're presenting for assessment, not for commercial purpose, this says an awful lot about what you've considered as you went through the design decisions. So it's very powerful and very effective in getting higher marks. It plays towards the fact that you've integrated several concepts, you've got a huge attention to detail, you're putting prefixes for the developers, you're putting their prefix definitions there, the key, you've said the purpose of things, you've said what they will hold, you've said what the controls will be called. There's a lot of things in here. One of the great powers of designing by sketch is that you can present an awful lot of information in quite a small space. There's a whole set of information in here of different types and for different purposes. So it's very powerful. Now there's another one here, much the same thing, just me laying things out, different form, different controls, but the same technique was used before I went on to do it in this form here. So this is hugely powerful. And what we're going to go on to in the next part of this video is about the diagrams. This is different to sketches. Sketches are drawn either in software or by hand. So let's now talk about diagrams. What is a diagram? It's a really interesting thing. A diagram usually shows flow or state. And there are several types of diagrams that are recognized in the software development communities, and they're kind of universal. So if I make a universal modeling language diagram, which is the first one on the list, which is going to be appropriate in object-oriented programming, if I make it here in the UK and I transmit it to somebody in another country, even if their language is not the same, they'll understand exactly what that diagram will say. This is also true of things that are used for database design, which you may know, like ERDs and so forth, and concept diagrams. It's a universal language that developers will always be able to understand. So the diagrams that we're talking about here are the UML, the DFD, which is a data flow diagram, and the flow chart. And once again, these have a very, very powerful effect when presented to the team and to the client, because they contain an awful lot of information graphically, which is easily understood and comprehended by different people. So the design diagrams that we're using here, this is an example of a UML class diagram. That's a standard modeling language. The unified modeling language is used to define classes, and this is just an example that I used in one of our development processes. Data flow diagrams come in many types, shapes, forms, and have lots of different levels of detail. They're described as layers, and this is a top layer or top tier DFD, showing how data moves around the system and is used at the various points when it's processed. And finally, we've got a thing called a flow chart. Now, the UML diagram that we described for classes is entirely appropriate, and flowcharts are often appropriate in event-driven programming, where an action takes place, that's the begin probably, and then things happen as the algorithm that's run is going through its various stages or steps or instructions. So these different diagrams have useful purpose in different circumstances. And if you're creating an application design set for an assessment, the diagrams once again will demonstrate a huge level of attention to detail, integration of different components of thought, and can convey an awful lot of information in a really neat and concise fashion. So they have a really, really high power in gaining good marks. If it's in a commercial situation, the client may not fully understand what happens within each step of the process that's been shown in a diagram, but they'll be able to understand the concept behind the diagram and maybe point out where things are correct or need to be done slightly differently. So diagrams are hugely powerful. Now, the item on the list that came after that was the navigation diagram. And that can be done as a wireframe, as a tree diagram, whatever it might be. And I don't have an example of that to show you. You just show as a set of arrows how the application will proceed as people move between different components or screens or GUIs within the application. So let's move on next to the data structures. In item 11, we talk about data structures. And let's just talk about OOP for a minute. And that's where you will clearly define all your classes. And you're going to have them as a drawing already, as a sketch, or a diagram in the unified modeling language. But now you should describe them in text. You should say what they're for, what they're going to do. There may be a precedence of building them. There may be one depending on the other and so forth. So you need to start to describe them all. Now, in OOP, if you're developing it in C#, Visual C# using Visual Studio, behind each interface there's also a set of classes which control the code behind. So you should describe what's in them, and you should make sure that they're as fully described as possible so that the developers can work with that description to produce the thing that's needed. So classes should link to the data, as well as the interaction that takes place in the application in terms of the forms and navigations and screens and so forth. So you're going to have to bring those in from your brief, and in this case I'm talking about an assignment brief, and make sure that those classes define what needs to happen with the data. That's talking about data interfacing. So this is maybe where your application has to talk to the outside world, and you'll describe how that will be done, what protocols are needed to establish a good connection or a safe connection or a secure connection with the data store. Now that may be outside in a different location geographically and so forth, so you need to describe very clearly how your application will get to the data to perform its CRUD, the create, the read, the update and the delete. So you'll define data classes. Now I've put a little note here because we were making an application in Ionic, and you talk about class data structures as interfaces. An interface is a template for a data set that needs to be implemented in a consistent way. So let's move on immediately to data transfer and storage methods. You need to understand how data will be passed between elements, between forms perhaps. That may be because one form is being developed by one developer and another form is being developed by a different developer, and they have to understand how data is output from a particular form and received as input in another form. You need to understand how data will be summarized, where it needs to be presented as a set of values that have been arrived at through a set of steps. You need to be able to understand really clearly how that summary will be displayed to the user. If you're using external storage files, and we use external text files as sources of data to replicate or mimic a database, explain how they will be used, what they are, and so forth. If you're going to store data on a permanent basis, you need to be really clear about how that data will be stored, the format it's going to be in, what connection method will need to be used. Are there web APIs? Is it direct to SQL? Is it a NoSQL database? It has to be defined very clearly so that all of the team who are implementing data use, be it in transfer or storage, will do it correctly to the specification that's been defined. Finally, in this video, I'm going to talk about item 13, which is the provision of help. Now this is in-application help, where something is clicked or ticked or whatever it is to provide a help feature. So you need to describe very clearly how that's going to happen so that your end user can be supported as they use the application. This is not the external manuals, it's not the offline help, it's how they will find help as they're using the application for all of the features of the application. Of course, they may link to the various other documents that we described in previous sections, but here you have to say how the user using the application will access the help they may need. We'll move on to the next part, which is about testing, and then we'll move on to describing the timelines.